The world has changed quite dramatically in an extremely short period of time of just 3.5 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And I'm quite certain at this point that the average person still has not grasped how significant these changes really are and how much they are going to define the next 100 years of humanity's future, and in fact, the future of warfare and geopolitics itself. You might think that what I'm talking about here is the significance of the mere fact that Russia is on the warpath and the fact that they have captured, at this point, a large portion of Ukraine's territory, and the way that the international community has responded or has not responded to that. But while all of those things are, of course, extremely important, in this video, I'm actually talking about something different entirely. What I'm talking about is how warfare has evolved and how this evolution of warfare is changing not only how wars are going to be fought in the future, but potentially how geopolitics functions and how future nations draw their maps, because of course that is intricately related with geopolitics. What we've really seen over the past 3.5 years is something akin to what happened in both World War I and World War II, and even if we want to go further back, something akin to what happened around the time of the invention of gunpowder, which were all periods of seismic shifts in the way that humanity approached warfare that changed who the winners and the losers were on the international stage. And what I'm talking about primarily is the significance of the evolution of drone warfare, which most people know about at a high level, but which most people haven't thought through the geopolitical implications of and how it impacts, for example, the arms trade and who is going to be the most powerful nation on Earth in the next 30 to 50 years. 4 years ago, as Russia was preparing for their full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it's become quite obvious that what they were expecting and anticipating was a sort of modified, updated version of World War II, where they would largely use the same types of tactics and the same types of equipment, sometimes literally the same equipment that they used in World War II to achieve similar types of objectives, and that these tactics and equipment would be augmented or supported by new modern systems such as drones. When we looked at the makeup of Russia's army, there were lots of tanks, lots of armored vehicles, which in World War II would have been the expected makeup of your military when you were trying to conquer a large, flat, plain country like Ukraine. But for Russia, what they saw was that what they thought the type of war they were fighting in was actually quite different from the war they would actually end up fighting in, as they quickly saw many multi-million-dollar tanks, multi-million-dollar armored vehicles being destroyed by drones that cost their operators literally often less than $1,000 to create. Now, not only could these drones easily destroy heavy equipment that cost many thousands of times more than the drone did to produce, but that fact also meant the drones had another special advantage, which was that they could be produced at scale very quickly, owing largely to the low cost, but also to the fundamental reasons behind the low cost in the first place, which is that drones do not require tons of raw materials to be brought together in order to make them functional. They can be produced extremely cheaply for comparatively basically no raw materials at all, and shipped to the battlefield, and also used rather recklessly because of their low cost. It became very clear then that this was a seismic shift in warfare. As we've observed these things over the past 3.5 years or so, we have seen a large shift in battlefield doctrine, where heavy equipment is no longer seen as the main event with drones supporting that heavy equipment, but rather, increasingly, drones are the main event, with heavy equipment being sent in rather sparingly to try to take advantage of holes that maybe drones have created, which is a completely different mindset and a completely different way of thinking about warfare, And it also means that the weapons systems that allowed certain countries to be the most powerful countries since the end of World War II may no longer hold the same power that they once did when it comes to the international world and geopolitics. We do have a lot of historical precedents for this exact sort of thing, where we see during an ongoing war an active acceleration in warfare technology, and how that affects not just the side who wins the war, but also how power systems are created among other nations once that war is concluded. A big example, of course, is World War I. In the years leading up to World War I, if you would have asked a European military commander, or really anybody who knew anything about the military at that time, what tactics would define that war and who is going to be victorious, they would have largely pointed to tactics reminiscent of the Napoleonic Wars, pointing back to things like cavalry, cannon, and large standing armies being drilled and used tactically, and whoever had the most professional army would ultimately come out as the victor. At that time, most commanders had no concept of how effective things like machine guns, or poison gas, or tanks, which weren't developed yet, could actually be. And so one of the reasons that World War I became so deadly is these armies went to the field against each other with these large standing armies using the tactics of 50 to 100 years ago, not realizing how dramatically warfare had changed. And they quickly discovered how much it had changed as men with machine guns could just sit still, basically, and take out entire units of the opposing army. That, of course, caused the war to quickly get locked into a conflict of trench warfare, with both sides desperately trying to innovate to develop the weapons that would allow them to break through that situation and ultimately allow them to come out on top. And of course, the weapons that were developed throughout World War I came to define who would win World War II, and so on it goes. If you were to ask most people, they could not have imagined these changes until they actually occurred, and something similar is going on in Ukraine, where an army has come in expecting to use the tactics of yesterday, not realizing how much today's technology nullifies those tactics. And now you desperately have both militaries trying to technologically advance so that they can overcome a situation that is essentially turned into trench warfare, just like World War I. As these technologies progress, everybody tends to focus on who has the strongest technological capability, who has the best drones that are the most reliable at the lowest cost, powered by the best AI. Because of course, those things are important. But because everybody gets so hyper-focused on that, what they often miss is the significance of everything that is changing around the technology and how much that changes the future of warfare. I get a lot of comments from military officers on this channel, and one of the recurring, most common comments that I agree with is this: amateurs think about tactics. Professionals think about logistics. And logistics is a huge reason why this new evolution of warfare, from World War II type tactics to rather using drone warfare, is so significant. And an example of why this is so significant, again, we can go back to World War I. Leading up to World War I, if you wanted to know which countries had the biggest advantages in warfare up to that time, one big advantage that you needed as a military was to have the best trained horses to power your cavalry. And so for a lot of countries, when you look throughout the medieval era, leading all the way up through the Napoleonic period, as long as horses and cavalry were used in combat, a lot of advantages went to the countries that could breed the best horses. Horse breeding, in a sense, was kind of like the arms trade of that time. And as that kind of shifted out in World War I, and countries now had access to things like tanks, and not just tanks, but just motorized vehicles in general, that advantage that just a century earlier might have been the difference between being an empire and not being very successful in the battlefield became almost nullified. And now the new advantage in the era of the tank and mechanized warfare was who has access to the best raw materials, who has access to the best coal, the best steel, the best iron, the best oil in the largest quantities. And that changed how warfare was fought. That changed what the strategic objectives were, and it changed who could be successful. In the modern day, the world has still existed under that same general overall system, where your success on the battlefield depended in large part on the sheer quantity and variety of raw resources that you could bring together to build your weapons. Yes, modern warfare has been defined by technology, but again, as I mentioned, most people saw it as a blend between heavy equipment and technology. As the equation tilts more and more away from the heavy equipment and more towards the technology, we're going to see the countries that have military advantages, we're going to see the differences between those countries shift a lot. One of the reasons that the global military powers have always been large countries like the United States, China, the Soviet Union, Russia, and the larger European countries is because they have always been in the modern era these countries that have access to the quantities and varieties of materials that are needed to actually build a large functional military. And essentially, there's just no reason for any other smaller nations to try to engage in that kind of a fight because they have no advantages. As things shift away from warfare being defined by who has the biggest stockpiles of resources, though those things won't totally go away, we will see a shift potentially in who militarily has the biggest advantages. And while the advantages of the large nations aren't going to completely go away, the capabilities of the smaller nations are going to become far, far greater. With that in mind, one of the things that I see as a major possibility over the next coming decades is for the United States' influence as a military superpower to decrease relatively. It's not going to go away, but it will decrease relatively, while a large portion of its influence will likely be replaced by one country in particular, and that country is Ukraine. Now, the reason I say Ukraine is going to grow in importance, it's not just wishful thinking, but it's because of what the new raw resource is going to be in this new era of drone warfare. And that raw resource is data. And not just any data, but high-quality data of actual battlefield scenarios that can be used to train your drones to be more effective than anybody else's. Ukraine has more data than just about anybody, and they definitely have a lot more data than the United States does when it comes to using and building effective drones. There's a lot of articles out there that talk about how the time to innovate drones has drastically increased by fourfold, some say even by up to eightfold, because instead of testing drones in simulated environments, Ukraine can actually innovate and test things directly on the battlefield. What that means is that currently, at this moment, Ukraine has the best drones in the entire world. And not only do they have the best drones in the entire world from an AI and data standpoint, but they also have the best drone production capacity in the entire world for a lot of reasons. Obviously, they're at war with Russia, and a lot of people are now shifting their focus from supplying Ukraine big heavy equipment like Leopard tanks and things like that, to actually just giving Ukraine money that Ukraine can use to develop drone production capacity on their own territory. And that is helping Ukraine ramp up around its advantage in the data space to create drones that each and every day are kind of leapfrogging the capabilities that even us in the United States, despite our much larger economy and our much larger capacity, are capable of producing. And very, very soon, Ukraine's drones will be miles ahead, and we won't be able to match those types of capabilities probably for several years unless Ukraine shares their data with us. Now, some people might challenge me on that a little bit. They might say Ukraine doesn't have the best drones in the world. They just kind of use a whole lot of cheap drones, and they get their parts from China, etc., etc. These people are missing the bigger picture. The main reason Ukraine uses a lot of cheap drones is because they are using those cheap drones specifically as disposable drones. And also, the most valuable piece of the drone isn't the drone itself, but it's rather the AI that powers the drone. You can have a very big, expensive drone that technically has a lot more capabilities than a Ukrainian drone. But if your AI cannot match the quality of Ukraine's AI, your drone can basically be made worthless very quickly, and this is why Ukraine has such a big advantage. You have to realize that as drone warfare has progressed in Russia's war against Ukraine, it's already gone through several evolutions. Obviously, at first people discovered the drones were causing huge havoc, and so what both sides did is they got really good at jamming those drones, basically blocking the signal between the drone and the person controlling it to basically make the drone effectively useless. And so both sides have innovated with now fiber optic drones. And these fiber optic drones can't be jammed because they are attached directly by a thin wire from the drone to the operator. This, of course, has some disadvantages. That cord can only be so long. The drones can get wrapped up on things. There's certain environments that they're not going to work as well in as a drone that is kind of free-flying and is not attached via fiber optic. But nevertheless, this has been an innovation. And so to get past this problem, what Ukraine and Russia have actively been trying to do is innovate a new, actually kind of frightening technology, which is drones that are completely autonomous, that select their targets using artificial intelligence, and can make kill commands completely autonomously. And the key factor that is allowing them to develop these capabilities is data. These capabilities allow a drone, even if it is jammed and cannot communicate with its controller, to complete its mission, which means that a relatively cheap Ukrainian drone that is loaded with the right algorithms that other expensive drones don't have will be much more effective than something that, for example, the United States can produce. For these reasons, Ukraine, after this war is completed, assuming they still have their drone technology and their drone factories intact, will be one of the world's preeminent suppliers of the most important military technology of our time. And not only does Ukraine have these advantages, but Ukraine also has other advantages that really everybody should pay attention to, because it actually gives Ukraine a lot of cards to play for or against countries that have not been very supportive of them. For one, Ukraine has the cards of geographical location. When it comes to buying arms, there's obviously a lot of factors that people consider, and geographical location of your supplier is one of them, because you want to be able to get your arms quickly, and you don't want there to be a big supply chain with potential bottlenecks. And Ukraine, of course, where it is located, is quite a strategic location for anybody who would want to purchase drones, particularly for customers in the Middle East, which are just over the Black Sea from Ukraine, and customers in the rest of Europe, the customers that are most likely to actually, unfortunately, be engaged in warfare over the next several decades. So this proximity and this location are obviously important, but Ukraine also has an advantage that the United States used to have, but that the United States is sort of now intentionally throwing away. And that advantage is something simple but powerful when it comes to arms sales: goodwill. When it comes to purchasing weapons, every country's worst nightmare is for the supplier that you depend on to decide that they don't want to send you weapons. And the United States has already done this to Ukraine several different times. In fact, they just did it again a couple of days ago. And the United States really doesn't understand the repercussions of making those kinds of calls. I've made an entire video on it, but it makes the United States look less trustworthy as an arms supplier. And a key fact in that is that to produce high-quality weapons, it's expensive to research and develop. And so the main way that you fund the production of high-quality weapons, if you're a country like the United States, is by having other countries within your sphere of influence that want to purchase your weapons. A lot of these countries aren't going to trust the United States which means the United States is not going to have a whole lot of funding from this area to help support its drone technologies, while comparatively Ukraine probably will. So what we see in sum and total then is that Ukraine is becoming a low-cost supplier of the most important military technology of our time. They are geographically positioned in the best possible place for the people who might want to purchase those drones from them. They also are having the biggest advantage when it comes to producing the best, most relevant drone technology, remaining at a low cost. So they're going to have a lot of advantages here. Now, if I was the President of the United States, I would be looking at the situation with a whole lot of interest. And I would be trying to think about the world not just as it exists today in this exact moment, but how the world might exist in 50 to 100 years, so that I don't become an army in a World War II that is still focused on horse breeders as a strategic advantage. And there's a real risk that the United States could move in that direction. Not completely, but it's a matter of degrees and extents. So if I was the President of the United States, I would be looking at this situation and I would be saying, look, the drone technology isn't quite there yet, but it's going to get there soon. What Ukraine needs right now, though, is help from the conventional weapons and the conventional military that we still have. So in exchange for getting some access to data with Ukraine in the future that will secure our position as a world power for centuries to come, I want to provide Ukraine with the resources that they need now to defeat the existential threat of Russia attacking their country. If Donald Trump were a real deal maker, this is a win-win deal for both sides that I think Ukraine would bite on in an instant. And so if this is the way to get Ukraine more weapons from the United States to defend themselves in this war of aggression, maybe it's an avenue that should be explored. By the same token, if the United States decides to stop sharing intelligence with Ukraine, as they've done in the past, if they decide to stop deliveries of weapons that they've already promised to Ukraine, upsetting their battlefield strategies because they were counting on these deliveries, Ukraine, of course, is also under no obligation to continue sharing drone data with the United States, which it currently does to a certain degree. If the United States wants to look at the war in Ukraine as merely transactional, which is unfortunately what the current administration is doing, Ukraine can play the same game that the United States is playing. And they can be transactional with the things that they have of value, and they do not have to give that to us for free. Even more than that, this discussion highlights the value that the United States has already received from Ukraine in exchange for helping them in this conflict. And though this conflict has been portrayed as one-sided, the United States just giving money to Ukraine and getting nothing in return, we see that the reality is exactly the opposite. If the United States wants to remain relevant as a military superpower in the decades to come, we need what Ukraine has. Ukraine has given that to us in exchange for us supporting them. That is how alliances work. That is how they should work. And hopefully, that is how they will continue to work, so that Ukraine and the United States can work together to protect and create a more democratic, freer world for now and in the future to come. Now, with that in mind, shifting discussions, a lot of you might also be thinking about Russia. Why does Ukraine have all these drone development advantages and Russia doesn't? Well, the truth is, Russia is trying to develop drones just like Ukraine is. But they are going to struggle for a lot of reasons. And it's the same reason that the Soviet Union lost the arms race to the United States, and why dictatorships like China have lost arms race to the United States, and the best they can do is copy US equipment. Within dictatorial societies, it is much harder to promote the innovation that is necessary in technological areas like this, simply because the incentives aren't there for entrepreneurs. A lot of people are afraid, especially in an oligarchical society like Russia, where the oligarchs steal all the wealth, that if they innovate for the country, they're not going to financially benefit from their innovation, and it's just going to be stolen by somebody else, And so that often stifles innovation that is much less common in democratic countries like Ukraine, which of course has its own problems, but is much more democratic than Russia is. So from a structural standpoint, Ukraine has all the advantages to beat Russia in the long term when it comes to this drone arms race. Now, we covered a lot of ground in this video. Some of these things I went through rather quickly, hopefully not too quickly, but I guess I'll know based on your comments and reactions to this video. This is definitely one where I want to probably do some follow-ups. So if there's anything you'd like me to go a little bit further on any of the individual topics within this video, let me know in the comments, and I will do my best to do that in a future video. That in mind, I'm going to close out. Thank you to everybody who supports this channel on Patreon. Buy me a coffee. Super thanks. You guys keep me energized and invigorated to keep doing what I'm doing. So thank you for all of the support. I'll see you on the next one.